Okay, so you're running Proxmox at home.
Right.
You've got your, your LXCs running.
Yeah.
Maybe image, keeping all your photos tidy.
Yeah.
Paperless-ngx, digitizing everything, keeping those PDFs, in order.
Sure.
But that little SSD that you started with, maybe it was just the 256 gig in that mini PC or that old server you're using.
Right.
It's starting to feel a little cramped.
Totally.
So where do you go from there?
Yeah, it's one of those things where, Proxmox makes it so easy to get started with virtualization.
Right.
And to kind of dip your toes in.
Right.
And then before you know it, you're like, oh, wait a minute. I've only got, a couple hundred gigs of local storage.
Right.
What do I do now?
So then you start looking at a NAS.
Of course.
Right. A network attached storage.
Yeah.
Maybe something like one of those little Ugreen asyncs or something.
Right.
And you think, okay, cool. I can just, put some drives in there. I can have terabytes of storage.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then you start thinking, well, how do I actually connect this thing?
Right.
Am I going to corrupt all my VMs?
Mm-hmm.
Is Proxmox going to freak out?
Yeah.
Am I going to be rebooting constantly?
Yeah.
Nobody wants that.
No, that's definitely not what you want when you're trying to just simplify your Homelab and have things running reliably.
So that's our mission today.
Okay.
We're going to deep dive into how to do this right.
Let's do it.
How to use a NAS with your Proxmox host.
Yep.
Without breaking anything, without making it, super unreliable.
Yeah, keep it stable.
And keeping in mind backups and things like that,
Absolutely.
How to not make your NAS a single point of failure.
Right.
So when we think about this, when we think about someone who's looking to connect a NAS to Proxmox, like what are the main things they're probably hoping to achieve?
I think the big ones are, number one, of course, more usable storage.
Sure.
At the end of the day, you're just running out of space. You need more space to put stuff.
Right.
But without breaking their existing setup.
Mm-hmm.
They've got VMs, they've got LXCs running.
Right.
Those are working. They don't want to have to reinstall things, reconfigure things.
Sure.
And they definitely don't want to, do something that's going to, if the NAS has a problem, that takes down their whole Proxmox environment.
Right.
Because that defeats the purpose.
Right.
So, keeping things stable, keeping things reliable. And then I think also, in the back of their mind, a lot of people are thinking, well, I might want to do a Proxmox cluster at some point.
Right.
So whatever I do here, I don't want to paint myself into a corner.
Right. So that when you do the cluster, it all works seamlessly.
Exactly.
Okay. So with those goals in mind, what's kind of like the first most reliable way someone can connect their NAS to Proxmox to get that extra storage?
So I would say the method that I found to be the most dependable is to actually mount the NAS on the Proxmox host operating system itself.
Okay.
And then use what are called bind mounts to make that storage available inside your containers.
Okay, can you walk us through what that actually means, what that looks like?
Sure. So the first thing you're doing is you're establishing a connection between your Proxmox host and a share on your NAS.
Right.
And you can do this a couple different ways. You can use NFS, which is the network file system.
Right.
It's kind of more natively integrated with the Linux kernel.
Sure.
Or you can use SMB, which is also known as CIFS.
Uh-huh.
The server message block. And this is something that's very common. A lot of NAS devices like your Synology and things like that have really good SMB support built in.
Right.
So basically what you're doing is, you're creating a link. Let's say you mount the NAS share to a specific directory on your Proxmox host. Like we'll say no NAS.
Yeah.
And then in your LXC configuration file, the container, you basically say, okay, I want this folder inside the container
Right.
to actually point to this NAS directory on the host.
Okay.
So at the operating system level, what's happening is it's creating a direct link to that physical location on the host's file system.
Okay.
So to the container, it just looks like a local directory.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the LXC thinks it's accessing a local folder.
Correct.
But it's being redirected by Proxmox to the storage on the NAS.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's being seamlessly redirected, and the container is none the wiser.
Oh, that's pretty clever. So what's the big advantage of doing it this way?
Well, the main benefit is that the LXC itself doesn't have to manage the network connection to the NAS.
Okay.
The Proxmox host is handling all that.
Right.
And so that tends to be more stable
Right.
and less prone to you don't have to worry about network-related issues arising from within the container itself.
Okay, so it's all kind of, handled up at that top level.
Correct.
Now, you mentioned being careful about permissions, especially with unprivileged containers, which, for security reasons, it's generally the recommended way to go.
Yes.
Why is that an important consideration?
So with unprivileged containers, the user and group IDs inside the container don't actually directly correspond to, like the root user on the Proxmox host.
Right.
So think of it like you've got, two apartment buildings.
Okay.
Right. They might call the same resident by a different number.
Right.
So when you mount a folder from the host into the container, you have to make sure that the file permissions on the NANs, align with the user inside the container.
Right.
And so you may need to adjust the UID and GID mappings in your LXC's configuration file.
Okay.
To basically create a sort of translation table.
Right.
So that it knows, user 1000 in the container is actually user, whatever on the host.
Yeah.
And that way they have the right read and write permissions.
Okay.
It can be a little bit fiddly to set up.
Right.
But it is important for maintaining that security.
Okay.
That separation between the container and the host.
So a little bit of permission management might be required.
Yes.
Now, what about performance? We're often talking about, a 1 gigabit Ethernet connection in the home.
Sure.
Is that going to be a huge bottleneck?
So for most Homelab use cases, I would say as long as what you're offloading to the NAS is like, your media files.
Yeah,
so
okay.
your photos, your documents, your videos, that kind of stuff.
Right.
1 gigabit is going to be perfectly acceptable.
Okay.
The key is to keep the operating system and the application files for your containers on the local SSD.
Right.
So that way the network connection is really just being used for, accessing and transferring that bulk data.
Right.
Which is typically not as sensitive to latency. So, as long as your application isn't constantly like reading and writing massive amounts of data to the NAS for like its fundamental operations,
Right.
you should experience pretty guessable performance.
Okay. So keep the speed sensitive stuff local.
Yes.
Use the NAS for the bulk storage.
Bulk storage, exactly.
Okay. Now, what if someone is feeling a little more cautious?
Right.
They want to minimize any chance that the NAS, has problems and that impacts their running containers.
Right.
What's the like super safe way to use a NAS with Proxmox?
So I would say the most risk-averse approach would be to basically dedicate the NAS entirely to backups.
Okay.
In this scenario, all of your LXCs, all your VMs, they're living on the local SSDs.
Right.
And the NAS is just there to safeguard your data.
So we're talking Proxmox backups stored on the NAS.
Yep.
Maybe even container level snapshots as a kind of, in-between measure.
Yeah. Sure, you can configure Proxmox to do regular backups of your VMs and LXCs to the NAS.
Yeah.
You can also leverage the snapshotting capabilities within Proxmox.
Right.
Maybe keep those snapshots on the NAS for a short period.
Right.
And of course, it's a great place to, just archive your important media and documents for long-term storage.
Yeah. So what's the big advantage here when it comes to reliability and uptime?
I mean, the biggest benefit here is just resilience. If your NAS has a hiccup, if it goes offline temporarily,
Right.
your Proxmox environment is going to keep humming along.
Right.
You're not going to have VMs freezing up because they can't talk to the NAS.
Right.
You don't have to worry about, those frustrating VM lockups.
Right.
Or potentially having to hard reboot your whole Proxmox node.
Right.
You have that peace of mind.
Yeah, that peace of mind sounds really nice.
Yeah.
And this ties in, with good backup habits anyway.
Absolutely.
Right. You mentioned the 3-2-1 backup rule.
Yeah, so the 3-2-1 rule is kind of like a fundamental principle of data protection.
Okay.
And it basically says you should have at least 3 copies of your data
Okay.
on at least 2 different types of storage media
Okay.
with at least 1 copy stored offsite.
Okay.
So, using your local SSDs and a NAS, that gets you a good chunk of the way there.
Okay.
And then that offsite copy, that could be, you could have a storage box with a provider like Hetzner.
Right.
Or it could be as simple as, an external hard drive that you keep at a friend's house.
Sure.
But the NAS definitely becomes a crucial part of that 2 different types of media
Right.
aspect of it.
And you also suggested connecting an external hard drive directly to the NAS for
Yeah.
backups as well.
Yeah. So that's a really good practice.
Okay.
You can configure your NAS to basically make regular sole backups of your Proxmox data to an external hard drive that's plugged right into it.
Yeah.
And that way, you have another local backup that's independent of your network connection.
Right.
And it can be significantly faster if you need to do like a large restore.
Right.
Like if you have a major failure, you don't have to pull it all down over the network. You can just, grab that drive and plug it in.
Okay, so two pretty solid options so far. We've
Yeah.
got the mount on the host and use bind mounts.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got the NAS purely for backups.
Correct.
Now let's talk about the one that might sound tempting at first,
Right.
but has a big warning label on it. And
Yeah.
that's actually running VMs or LXCs directly from the NAS.
Right.
You had a big think twice recommendation there.
Yeah.
Why is that so risky for the average home user?
So while it is technically possible, you can present storage on your NAS to Proxmox.
Right.
You can use CIFS, you can use NFS, you can even use ISCSI,
Right.
which is the Internet Small Computer Systems interface.
Right.
It's basically another way to access storage over a network.
Right.
But the big problem here is that you're introducing a really significant single point of failure, which is your network connection.
Okay. Can you elaborate on the potential problems there? What's the worst case scenario?
So imagine that your VM's virtual hard disk, right? It's essentially a file.
Right.
It's sitting on your NAS.
Right.
If that network connection drops
Right.
for any reason,
Right.
maybe your NAS reboots, maybe a network cable gets unplugged, maybe your switch has a problem,
Right.
the VM instantly loses access to its storage.
Okay.
And that can cause the VM to completely freeze.
Right.
And in some cases, you might not even be able to gracefully shut it down.
Exactly.
You might end up having to force a reboot of your whole Proxmox node.
Right.
And trust me, that's something I've learned the hard way.
Yeah, the ask me how I know is always a red flag.
Right. Yeah. It's not a good feeling.
So under what very specific and perhaps unlikely circumstances might someone even consider this? What would their setup have to be like to even think about doing this?
So you would need to have really, really reliable networking hardware.
Okay.
We're talking, enterprise grade redundant network links.
Right.
So that a single cable failure doesn't bring everything down.
Right.
You would also probably need a very high bandwidth, low latency connection.
Okay.
So we're talking 10 gigabit Ethernet or faster.
Okay.
Because otherwise the performance is just going to be really bad.
Sure.
And you would need a NAS that is specifically designed for, sustained I/O operations.
Right.
And high network throughput.
Okay.
So we're not talking your typical entry-level Synology or your Greenbox here.
Right. Right.
And even then, for most Homelab users, I just don't think it's worth the hassle.
Right.
It's more suited for very specific testing environments, not for a stable day-to-day production setup.
So general consensus, avoid running your core stuff from the NAS.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay. Now, a lot of people running Proxmox eventually start thinking, okay, you know what?
Yeah.
I'm ready to go bigger.
Right.
I want to set up a cluster.
Yep.
How does the NAS fit into the clustering picture?
So when you start thinking about clustering,
Yeah.
consistency becomes really important.
Okay.
So if you're using the mount on host bind to container method that we talked about earlier,
Right.
you have to make sure that NAS is mounted to the exact same path on every single node in your Proxmox cluster.
Okay.
So if you mounted two Mantons on one server and Medianas on another,
Right.
you're going to have problems.
Right.
Because Proxmox relies on those paths being consistent
Sure.
for things like VM migration
Right.
and shared storage configurations within the cluster.
Right. Right. So inconsistent paths equals chaos.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. Now, what about Proxmox backup server?
PBS.
PBS, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned it before. How does that work with a NAS in a multi-node setup?
So PBS is really a great solution for clustered environments.
Okay.
So what you can do is you can actually run PBS within its own dedicated LXC,
Okay.
which of course you'd probably keep on your local SSD
Right.
for performance reasons.
Okay.
But inside that PBS container, you can mount your NAS.
Okay.
And so then PBS can handle all of the, the incremental backup, the deduplication, the versioning, all that good stuff
Right.
of your VMs and LXCs from all of the nodes in your cluster.
Okay.
And it can store those backups on the mounted NAS.
Okay.
And the nice thing about PBS is that it's designed to work efficiently even over a 1 gigabit network.
So PBS is acting as kind of like a centralized backup repository,
Right.
but it's using the NAS for the storage.
Exactly.
Okay. So that sounds like a pretty nice organized way to do it for a cluster. And you also briefly mentioned Ceph
Yeah.
as a more like advanced option for shared storage in a full cluster.
So Ceph is like a distributed storage system
Okay.
that can provide like a really resilient, highly scalable storage pool across your whole Proxmox cluster.
Okay.
But it's significantly more complex to set up and manage,
Okay.
and really kind of warrants its own deep dive.
Sure.
For most users who are just starting to dip their toes into clustering and they want to integrate a NAS,
Right.
PBS is going to be a much more approachable and effective first step.
Okay, so PBS, the more practical solution for a lot of folks.
I would say so, yeah.
Now let's go back to those two main protocols for connecting to the NAS,
Okay.
SMB and NFS.
Right.
You said both can work.
Yeah.
Are there any general recommendations for when you might want to choose one over the other in a Proxmox setting?
So broadly speaking, I would say SMB, which is also known as CIFS, it tends to be a bit simpler to configure, especially if you're using a NAS that has like a nice user-friendly interface, like a Synology or something like that.
Right.
They often have really good SMB support built in.
Right.
And it also generally has better compatibility if you have a mix of operating systems accessing the NAS.
Okay.
So if you've got, Windows machines and Macs and Linux machines all trying to talk to the NAS.
Sure.
SMB is usually going to be the easiest way to go.
Right.
NFS, on the other hand, it's a bit more natively integrated with Linux.
Right.
And so it can sometimes provide a little bit better performance in a purely Linux environment.
Okay.
Due to lower overhead.
Okay.
But it can also be a bit more sensitive when it comes to like user ID and permission mapping.
Right.
So you might need to do a little bit more manual configuration to get it right.
Okay. So SMB for ease of setup, mixed OS compatibility, NFS for maybe a little bit better Linux to Linux performance,
potentially,
but maybe a little bit more configuration.
Yeah, you might have to tweak a few things to get it working just right.
So really, it sounds like it comes down to personal preference and what you can get working reliably.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if you get one working and it's solid, there's no compelling reason to switch to the other one.
Right.
Just for the sake of it.
Right. It's like if it ain't broke.
Exactly.
Now here's a slightly different angle to consider.
Okay.
A lot of these NAS devices these days are getting pretty powerful.
They are, yeah.
They can even run Docker containers.
Yep.
They can host virtual machines.
Right.
So could someone just say, you know what, forget this whole connecting it to Proxmox thing. I'm just going to run Immich directly on the NAS.
Right.
Or I'm going to run Paperless-ngx directly on the NAS. Is that a reasonable thing to do?
So technically, yes. A lot of these modern NAS devices do offer those capabilities.
Right.
You can run Docker containers. You can even run, lightweight VMs directly on the NAS.
Right.
But there are some trade-offs that you have to be aware of.
Okay. What are the main drawbacks of going down that route?
So I think that the primary drawbacks are that you're essentially splitting your services across different management interfaces.
Okay.
So, you're losing that centralized view that you get with Proxmox of all of your virtualized workloads.
Right.
And so that can increase the overall complexity of your setup.
Right.
And potentially make troubleshooting more challenging.
Okay.
If you've already got your services running cleanly within Proxmox.
Right.
There's usually not a strong reason to migrate those workloads over to the NAS.
Right.
It's often cleaner to just keep the NAS focused on its core competency, which is providing storage.
Okay.
And let Proxmox handle the compute resources.
Right. So keep it simple.
Exactly.
Keep it centralized.
Yeah. Less moving parts, the better.
Now that we've, kind of gone through all these different strategies, what would you say is the overall best, most recommended setup for most people who are looking to expand their Proxmox storage with a NAS?
So I would say for the vast majority of Homelab users, I would recommend this.
Mm-hmm.
Keep your LXCs, keep your VMs running on your local SSDs
Okay.
for optimal performance.
Okay.
Mount your NAS to the Proxmox host
Okay.
using either SMB or NFS, whichever one you find easier to configure, more reliable,
Right.
and then use Proxmox's bind mount feature
Right.
to basically selectively provide, storage access from the mounted NAS into the specific containers that need it.
Okay.
So, maybe your media server container, your document archive container,
Right.
things like that.
Yep.
And crucially, make sure that you're using that NAS as your primary destination for
Right.
all of your backups,
Okay.
including, regular local backups to an external hard drive connected to the NAS.
Right.
And ideally an offsite backup as well.
Okay. So local storage for speed, for responsiveness.
Correct.
NAS for bulk storage.
Yeah.
And backups.
Comprehensive backups, yeah.
What are the key advantages of this kind of recommended setup?
So I think it gives you a really nice balance of performance and stability
Okay.
because, by keeping your compute workloads local,
Right.
you're minimizing your reliance on the network for critical operations.
Right.
Using bind mounts
Right.
gives you a pretty dependable way to extend storage into containers
Okay.
without making them, directly dependent on the network mount for,
Right.
for the core function.
Yeah.
Having the NAS handle all your backups gives you a central, hopefully redundant location
Right.
for all of your precious data. And this setup is also generally going to be easier to diagnose and troubleshoot if you have any problems.
Right.
So, if something goes wrong, you can usually pretty quickly pinpoint where the issue is.
Okay. And the biggest principle to keep in mind with all this.
Always remember that network storage, while it's incredibly useful,
Right.
it is not the same as local storage.
Right.
So be prepared for, occasional network hiccups.
Right.
Anticipate that there might be, minor connectivity issues from time to time.
Right.
And most importantly, make sure that you have a robust, well-tested backup strategy.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, the goal here is to make your NAS a dependable storage solution
Sure.
that alleviates your Homelab anxieties, not creates new ones.
Yeah. We want to reduce that Homelab stress, not add to it.
Exactly. Yeah, we want to make it fun.
Okay. So to kind of bring it all together, we've explored a bunch of different ways you can integrate a NAS with your Proxmox Homelab.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We talked about the reliability of mounting on the host
Mhm.
and using bind mounts.
Yes.
We talked about, the essential role of the NAS and a good backup plan.
The 3-2-1 rule.
The 3-2-1 rule, absolutely.
Got to have those backups.
And why running VMs directly from the NAS is generally, something to avoid for most folks.
Yeah, unless you have a very specific use case and a very, very robust setup.
We also touched on the importance of those consistent mount points,
Yes.
for if you're thinking about clustering down the road.
Very important for clustering.
And the benefits of Proxmox Backup Server in that context.
PBS, great tool.
And we talked about the trade-offs between SMB and NFS,
Right.
for connectivity and why keeping your applications, within Proxmox.
Right.
But using the NAS for storage is often the cleanest, most